Sometimes, the most precious things we lose find their way back to us when we least expect it. In the harsh frontier, where families were torn apart and memories buried in dust, hope seemed as distant as yesterday's sunset. An old Apache warrior rides into a small settlement, his heart heavy with decades of loss. He only wants supplies before moving on. But near the horse pen, he sees a young girl caring for an injured mare. Around her neck is a beaded necklace that makes his breath catch. The pattern is one he knows by heart. It belonged to his little sister who vanished during the forced relocations years ago. This pale-skinned child wears the sacred beadwork of his family. How is this possible? What happened to bring his sister's necklace to this frontier town? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weathered Apache warrior named Ayana had ridden through 3 territories to reach this dusty settlement, his faithful paint horse carrying him across lands that once knew only the footprints of his ancestors. At 62, his back bore the ache of countless miles, and his dark eyes held the weight of memories that stretched back to when buffalo herds darkened the plains. The leather medicine pouch at his side, cracked and softened by decades of wear, contained the sacred items that connected him to a world that seemed to slip further away with each passing season. Ayana had once served as a scout for the cavalry, a choice that still haunted his dreams. He had believed, in his younger years, that cooperation might save his people from the worst of what was coming. Instead, he had watched helplessly as his family was scattered to the winds during the forced relocations. His sister Nayeli among those who had simply vanished one terrible winter morning when the soldiers came with their lists and their chains. The settlement before him now was typical of the frontier towns that had sprouted like weeds across what had once been Apache hunting grounds. Wooden buildings weathered gray by wind and sun lined a single main street, and the constant creak of windmill blades provided a melancholy soundtrack to daily life. The general store doubled as a post office, its porch sagging under the weight of too many harsh seasons. A small church with a crooked steeple stood at one end of town, while a blacksmith forge sent sparks dancing into the late afternoon air at the other. But it was the corral that drew Ayana's attention, a simple enclosure of rough-hewn posts where several horses milled about in the fading light. And there, kneeling in the dust beside a limping mare, was the girl who would change everything. Sarah McKinnon was 12 years old, though her serious demeanor and gentle way with animals suggested wisdom beyond her years. Her hair, the color of prairie grass in autumn, hung loose around her shoulders as she spoke in soft whispers to the injured horse. She had been doing this for as long as anyone could remember, somehow knowing exactly what hurt creatures needed, whether they walked on 4 legs or 2. Thomas Whitman, the settlement's unofficial leader and owner of the general store, had found Sarah as an infant 13 years ago. The story, as he told it to newcomers, was both simple and heartbreaking. After a particularly brutal Apache raid on a wagon train, the cavalry had pursued the attackers deep into the desert. When they returned days later, they brought with them a baby girl, found hidden beneath the body of her mother, a young Apache woman who had managed to crawl far enough from the battle to conceal her child before succumbing to her wounds. The necklace had been around the baby's neck, even then an intricate pattern of turquoise and silver beads that caught the light like captured starlight. Thomas's wife Mary had wanted to remove it, concerned about its heathen origins, but something in the baby's cries when they tried suggested the jewelry was more than mere ornament. It stayed, becoming as much a part of Sarah as her gentle spirit and mysterious way with animals. Mary McKinnon, for they had given the foundling their own surname, was a woman of fierce love and quiet strength. She had lost 3 babies of love, her own to frontier hardships before Sarah came into their lives, and she embraced the child as completely as if she had carried her in her own womb. Thomas, too, found his heart captured by the serious little girl who seemed to understand the language of every living creature she encountered. As Ayana approached the corral, his trained eye immediately assessed the mare's condition. The animal favored her left foreleg, and the way she held her head suggested pain that went beyond simple muscle strain. But it was not the horse that made his breath catch in his throat. It was the necklace around the girl's neck, glinting in the dying sunlight. The pattern was unmistakable. Each bead had been placed according to traditional Apache methods passed down through generations of his family. The turquoise stones had been gathered from sacred sites, blessed by medicine women, and arranged in a design that told the story of his lineage. Only his grandmother had known the complete pattern, and she had taught it only to her daughters and granddaughters, including his beloved sister Nayeli. "Easy now, beautiful girl," Sarah was murmuring to the mare, her small hands moving with practiced confidence along the animal's leg. "I know it hurts, but we're gonna make it better." The words were in English, but something in the rhythm, the cadence, reminded Ayana so powerfully of his sister's voice that his chest tightened with old grief. Nayeli had spoken to horses in exactly that way, with a gentleness that could calm the wildest stallion. "Excuse me, little one," Ayana said quietly, not wanting to startle either girl or horse. Sarah looked up, a green eye so unlike typical Apache coloring, yet somehow familiar, meeting his without fear. "Hello," she said simply. "Are you? You're about the horses? Papa Tom says we might be able to trade for some good breeding stock." "I am here for supplies," Ayana replied carefully, though his eyes remained fixed on the necklace. "But I know something about horses. This mare, she has more than a simple strain, I think." "That's what I was afraid of," Sarah said, her young face creasing with worry. "She came in yesterday, and she's trying so hard to be brave, but I can see it in her eyes. The pain goes deep." As if summoned by their conversation, Thomas Whitman appeared from the direction of his store, wiping his hands on a worn apron. He was a man in his 50s, with the kind of steady bearing that made him a natural leader in frontier communities. His hair had gone silver at the temples, and his eyes held the particular weariness of a man who had seen too much hardship, but refused to let it break his spirit. "Sarah, you shouldn't be bothering our visitor," Thomas said gently, though his tone held no real reproach. "I'm Tom Whitman," he continued, extending his hand to Ayana. "Welcome to Cedar Flats." "I am called Ayana," the Apache replied, accepting the handshake with the careful courtesy of a man who had learned to navigate between worlds. "Your daughter was not bothering me. She has good instincts with horses." "She surely does," Thomas agreed, and the pride in his voice was unmistakable. "Sarah's got a gift with animals that I've never seen the like of. They just seem to trust her from the moment they meet." As they spoke, Mary Whitman emerged from the small house behind the store, drawn by the sound of unfamiliar voices. She was a woman whose beauty had been tempered by frontier life into something deeper and more enduring. Strength that showed in the set of her shoulders, and kindness that lived in her eyes. When she saw Ayana, she paused, her gaze taking in his traditional dress and the dignified bearing that marked him as a man of respect among his people. "Mary, this is Ayana," Thomas said. "He's traveling through, needs supplies." "You're welcome here," Mary said simply, and meant it. Despite the tensions that often existed between settlers and native peoples, the McKinnons had learned long ago that character mattered more than the color of a person's skin or the traditions they followed. "Your daughter," Ayana said, his voice carefully neutral. "She wears beautiful jewelry." Mary's hand moved instinctively to her throat, a gesture Ayana recognized as protective. "The necklace came with her when she was found," she said quietly. "We've never known its history." "It is Apache work," Ayana said, watching Sarah as she continued her gentle ministrations to the mare. "Very old pattern, sacred to certain families." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions. Thomas and Mary exchanged a look that spoke of 13 years of wondering about their adopted daughter's origins, while Sarah, still focused on the horse, seemed unaware of the undercurrents swirling around her. "How old is your daughter?" Ayanna asked, though he already suspected the answer. 12, Mary replied. "She'll be 13 come spring. 13 years." The timing aligned perfectly with the last confirmed sighting of his sister during the winter relocations, when so many Apache had scattered to escape the soldiers' roundups. Ayanna's heart began to beat faster, but he kept his expression carefully composed. "This mare," he said, changing the subject but not his purpose. "She will need special care. Traditional healing methods, not just time and rest. Could you help her?" Sarah asked, looking up with hope shining in her unusual green eyes. "I can tell she wants to get better, but I don't know enough yet." "Yet?" Ayanna repeated, struck by the word choice. "Well, there's always more to learn about helping animals," Sarah said matter-of-factly. "Papa Tom says I have good instincts, but instincts only take you so far. Sometimes you need real knowledge, too." The wisdom in her words, the mature way she thought about learning and growing, reminded Ayanna so powerfully of Nayeli that he had to look away for a moment to compose himself. His sister had been like that, always eager to learn, always pushing to understand not just the what but the why of their traditional ways. "I could show you some methods," Ayanna said carefully, "if your parents agree and if you're truly interested in learning." "Oh, could you really?" Sarah's face lit up with genuine excitement. "I would love that so much." Thomas and Mary exchanged another glance, this one longer and more complex. They had always known this day might come when someone would recognize the necklace, when questions about Sarah's past might finally have answers. They had dreaded it and hoped for it in equal measure, wanting their daughter to know her heritage while fearing they might lose her to it. "We would be grateful for your help with the mare," Thomas said finally. "And Sarah is always eager to learn new things about animals. But she is our daughter," Mary finished quietly, her voice carrying a mother's protective strength. "Whatever her blood might be, whatever her past, she is ours, and we are hers." Ayanna nodded with deep respect. "A child belongs to those who love and raise her," he said. "This is true in Apache families as well. Blood is important, but love is what makes a family." The words seemed to ease some of the tension in Mary's shoulders, though her protective instincts remained clearly visible as evening settled over. Cedar Flats, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Ayanna made his decision. He would stay longer than planned. Whether this girl was truly connected to his lost sister or not, the necklace was undeniably Apache, and its presence here suggested a story that needed telling. More than that, something in Sarah's manner, her way with animals, her unconscious gestures, the rhythm of her speech when she spoke to the horses awakened memories of home that had been sleeping in his heart for too many years. "I will need a place to camp," he said, "and permission to gather certain plants for the mare's healing. In return, I will teach your daughter what I can about traditional horse medicine. There's a good spot by the creek," Thomas offered. "Clean water, some shelter from the wind. You're welcome to stay as long as needed." As the adults continued their careful negotiations, Sarah remained focused on the mare, her young hands never ceasing their gentle movements along the animal's neck and shoulder. In the growing twilight, with her hair catching the last rays of sunlight and the ancient necklace gleaming at her throat, she looked exactly like what she might be, a bridge between worlds, carrying the blood of two peoples and belonging fully to both. Ayanna settled his medicine pouch more securely at his side, feeling the weight of the sacred items within. Tomorrow, he would begin teaching this remarkable girl about the healing arts of his people. And perhaps, in the process, he might finally learn what had become of his beloved sister Nayeli, whose memory lived on in turquoise and silver beads. Around the neck of a frontier child who spoke to horses in the language of the heart. Dawn came gently to Cedar Flats, painting the eastern horizon in soft pastels that reminded Ayana of his childhood mornings in the mountains. He had slept peacefully by the creek, lulled by the familiar sound of running water and the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. His dreams had been filled with memories of Naeli, her laughter, her gentle way with the horses their family had prized, and most painfully, the morning she had simply been gone when the soldiers finished their counting. Sarah appeared at the creek's edge just as the sun cleared the horizon, moving with the quiet confidence of a child who knew every stone and root on her family's land. She carried a small basket and wore a simple calico dress, but it was her purposeful stride that caught Ayana's attention. This was not a child coming to stare at the exotic visitor. This was someone with work to do. "Good morning," she said, politely. "Mama Mary sent breakfast, but I was hoping we could check on the mare first. I've been worried about her all night." "The healer who puts her patients before her own comfort," Ayana observed with approval. "This is the Apache way as well." They walked together toward the corral, and Ayana found himself studying the girl's movements. There was something in the way she stepped, careful but confident, reading the ground beneath her feet, that reminded him powerfully of his sister. Naeli had moved like that, always aware of her surroundings, always in harmony with the earth. The mare stood in the morning light, clearly favoring her injured leg, but alert and responsive when Sarah approached. The animal's ears pricked forward at the sight of the girl, and she nickered softly in greeting. "She knows you," Ayana said. "Already. She trusts you completely." "Animals are honest," Sarah replied, running her hands gently along the mare's neck. "They don't pretend to feel things they don't feel, and they can tell when people are genuine. She knows I want to help her." As Sarah worked, Ayana gathered plants from around the settlement, willow bark for pain, comfrey for healing, and other herbs that his grandmother had taught him to recognize. When he returned, he found Sarah kneeling in the dust beside the mare's injured leg, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I can feel where it hurts the most," she said without looking up. "Right here, where the muscle connects to the bone. It's not just strained, there's something torn inside." Ayana knelt beside her, gently palpating the area she had indicated. Her assessment was exactly correct. "You have healing hands," he said, "and eyes that see what others miss. These are gifts that cannot be taught, only awakened." Under his guidance, Sarah learned to prepare a poultice from the gathered herbs, grinding them with smooth river stones and mixing them with clean water. Her movements were intuitive, as if some part of her remembered the process even though she had never been taught it. "Like this?" she asked, showing him the mixture. Ayana examined her work and nodded with genuine surprise. The consistency was perfect, the proportions exactly right. "Better than many medicine women I have known," he said honestly. "Where did you learn to do this?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, looking puzzled herself. "It just felt right, like my hands knew what to do." As they applied the poultice to the mare's leg, Ayana began to teach her the traditional Apache ways of speaking to injured animals, not just with words, but with breath and touch and the intention of the heart. Sarah absorbed every lesson. Like parched earth drinking rain, her natural abilities amplifying everything he showed her. It was while they worked together that Sarah's hand brushed against a sharp stone half buried in the corral dirt. She picked it up, brushing away the earth, and held it up to examine it in the morning light. "Oh," she breathed, her voice filled with wonder. In her palm lay an arrowhead, not the crude points made by novices, but a beautifully crafted piece that spoke of generations of skill and tradition. The obsidian was napped with perfect precision, its edges sharp enough to cut leather, its point true and deadly. But what made Ayana's heart race was not the quality of the workmanship, it was the distinctive style, the particular shape and flaking pattern that marked it as the work of his own people. "It's beautiful," Sarah whispered, turning the arrowhead to catch the light. "Someone made this by hand, didn't they? Shaped every edge on purpose." "Yes," Ayanna said quietly. "This is very old. Apache work from before the reservations." Sarah's fingers moved over the arrowhead with surprising familiarity, tracing the edges with the confidence of someone who understood the craft. Without conscious thought, she began to chip at a rough edge with her fingernail, adjusting the point's balance with movements that spoke of inherited knowledge. "Sarah," Ayanna said carefully, "how do you know to do that?" She looked up, startled. "By her own actions." I don't know. It just seemed like it needed to be fixed." She examined the arrowhead again, her young face creasing with confusion. "Why do I know how to do this?" Before Ayanna could answer, Thomas Whitman approached from the direction of his store, his expression troubled. Behind him walked Reverend Peters, the settlement's preacher, and two other men Ayanna didn't recognize. The Reverend's face was set in hard lines of disapproval, and the other men carried themselves with the particular tension of people looking for trouble. "Sarah, honey," Thomas said gently, "come away from there now. Your mother needs you in the house." "But Papa Tom, we're helping the mare," Sarah protested. "The medicine is working. Look how much better she's standing." "The child should not be learning heathen practices," Reverend Peters said sharply. "It's not proper for a Christian girl to be dabbling in savage superstitions." Ayanna rose slowly, his movements deliberately calm and non-threatening, but his dark eyes flashed with controlled anger. "The healing arts honor all life," he said quietly. "There is nothing savage in relieving pain. You've been here one day, and already you're filling the girl's head with Indian nonsense," one of the other men said. "We know what happens when your kind gets too comfortable in civilized places." Sarah looked from face to face, her young mind struggling to understand the sudden tension. The arrowhead was still clutched in her small fist, and she seemed reluctant to let go of it. "The child has natural gifts," Ayanna said, directing his words to Thomas. What she did with this mare finding the exact source of the injury, preparing the medicine, these are not things that can be taught quickly. She knew them already, somewhere deep inside. "That's what I'm afraid of," Reverend Peters muttered. Sarah's face flushed with confusion and hurt. "I don't understand. What did I do wrong?" "The mare feels better, that's good, isn't it?" Mary Whitman appeared at that moment, drawn by the raised voices. She took one look at the scene, her daughter in the middle of a circle of tense adults, clutching something in her hand while the Apache warrior stood protectively nearby, and her maternal instincts flared. "What's going on here?" she demanded, moving to place herself between Sarah and the men who clearly meant trouble. "Your daughter's been learning Indian ways," Reverend Peters said. "Playing with artifacts, practicing heathen rituals. It's not fitting for a Christian child." Mary's eyes found the arrowhead in Sarah's hand, and her expression grew complex. She had always known this day might come, when Sarah's heritage would call to her, when the blood of her birth people would make itself known. "Sarah," she said gently, "what did you find?" "An arrowhead, Mama Mary, and when I touched it, it felt familiar. Like I'd held one before, even though I know I never have." Sarah's voice was small, confused by the adults' reactions to what had felt like a wonderful discovery. That night, Sarah lay in her narrow bed staring at the ceiling beams and thinking about the day's strange events. The arrowhead rested on her nightstand, catching moonlight from the window, and she found herself reaching for it again and again. Each time she touched it, something stirred in her memory, not clear images, but feelings, sensations, the echo of voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize but somehow understood. The mare had responded beautifully to their treatment. By evening, she was putting weight on her injured leg and nickering hopefully whenever Sarah approached. The healing had worked exactly as Ayanna had promised it would. Yet somehow her success had created more problems than it solved. Through her thin wall, she could hear her parents talking in low, worried voices. Words drifted through heritage, identity, where she belongs, and Sarah realized with growing alarm that the adults were talking about her future, making decisions that would shape her life in ways she couldn't yet understand. Outside, she could see the glow of Ayana's small campfire by the creek. Part of her wanted to creep out of the house and sit by that fire, to ask him the questions that burned in her mind like embers. Who had made the arrowhead? Why did touching it feel like coming home? And most importantly, why did working with him to heal the mare feel like the most natural thing she had ever done in her short life? The arrowhead seemed to pulse with warmth in her hand, and Sarah closed her eyes, letting herself drift towards sleep while holding tight to this piece of a puzzle she was only beginning to understand. Tomorrow, she decided, she would ask Ayana to teach her more. Whatever the adults said about heathen practices and proper behavior, she knew with absolute certainty that helping the mare had been right. The healing power that flowed through her hands when she worked with the Apache warrior felt like the truest thing she had ever experienced in her dreams that night. Sarah walked across endless desert landscapes under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Voices called to her in that half-familiar language, and she found herself understanding every word, responding in kind. When she woke at dawn, the Apache phrases were still on her lips, though she had no conscious memory of ever hearing them before. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when Sarah slipped from the house, her bare feet silent on the wooden porch. She had lain awake most of the night, thinking about the arrowhead, about the strange familiarity of the healing work, and about the way Ayana's presence seemed to awaken something deep within her that she had never known was sleeping. She found him by the creek, tending a small fire and preparing what appeared to be breakfast cornmeal mixed with wild berries and flavored with herbs she couldn't identify. The smoke carried a scent that made her stomach growl, but more than that, it stirred another of those mysterious memories that seemed to live just beyond her conscious reach. "You are up early, little healer," Ayana said without turning around. "The mare called to you in your dreams?" Sarah started, then realized she shouldn't be surprised that he had heard her approach. "How did you know I was coming?" "The earth tells stories to those who listen," he replied, offering her a bowl of the steaming mixture. "Your footsteps have their own rhythm, different from your father's heavy boots or your mother's quick steps. And troubled hearts often seek the dawn for answers." The food was unlike anything Mary had ever prepared, earthier, more complex, with flavors that seemed to connect directly to something primal in Sarah's being. She ate hungrily, surprised by how right it tasted. "I dreamed in Apache last night," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "At least, I think it was Apache. I understood everything, but when I woke up, I couldn't remember what the words meant." Ayana's hand stilled on his own bowl. "What did the voices in your dream tell you?" "They were calling me home," Sarah whispered. "But I don't know where home is supposed to be." For a long moment, they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the creek's gentle murmur and the awakening sounds of the settlement. Finally, Ayana reached into his leather pouch and withdrew a small wooden flute, carved with intricate designs and worn smooth by countless hands. "This belonged to someone very dear to me," he said, holding the instrument with reverence. "She had a gift for music, especially the songs that calm frightened animals." He raised the flute to his lips and began to play a melody that was both mournful and beautiful, rising and falling like wind across desert stones. The notes seemed to carry stories within them, tales of wide skies and endless horizons, of people who moved with the seasons and found home wherever their families gathered. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, though she couldn't explain why. The music touched something so deep within her that it felt like physical pain and perfect joy combined. Without thinking, she began to hum along, her voice finding harmonies she had never learned but somehow knew by heart. Ayana lowered the flute, his dark eyes wide with wonder. "Child, how do you know that song?" "I don't," Sarah said, confused by her own actions. "I've never heard it before, but when you played it, I could hear other voices singing along. Women's voices, high and sweet, and children laughing. They were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Mary Whitman, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and wearing the particular expression of a mother who had discovered her child missing from bed. "Sarah McKinnon, you scared me half to death," Mary said, though her relief at finding her daughter safe was evident in her voice. "I thought we had agreed you wouldn't wander off without telling someone." "I'm sorry, Mama Mary. I couldn't sleep, and I wanted to check on the mare." "The mare is much improved," Ayana said diplomatically. "Your daughter's treatment was very effective." Mary's expression softened slightly as she studied the Apache warrior. Despite the previous day's tensions, she could see nothing threatening in this man who spoke gently to her daughter and treated a wooden flute like a precious relic. "What is that you're holding?" she asked. "A flute that belonged to my sister," Ayana replied. "I was sharing one of her favorite songs with Sarah, and I knew it," Sarah added wonderingly. "I knew the harmony even though I'd never heard the melody before." Mary felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. She had always known this day might come, when Sarah's heritage would call to her more strongly than the life they had built together. She had hoped it would happen later, when Sarah was older and better able to understand the complexities of belonging to two worlds. "Perhaps," Mary said carefully, "you could teach her some of your horse training methods. Practical skills she could use to help the animals here." It was a compromise, and all three of them recognized it as such. Mary was acknowledging Sarah's natural gifts while trying to keep them channeled in safe directions. Ayana was being offered the chance to continue working with the girl while respecting the boundaries her adoptive parents needed to maintain. Over the following days, a routine developed. Each morning, Sarah would meet Ayana by the creek for what they came to call horse lessons, though they encompassed far more than simple training techniques. He taught her to read the subtle signs that indicated an animal's health and mood, the position of ears, the quality of breathing, the way weight was distributed across all four legs. Under his guidance, she learned that horses were individuals, each with their own personality and preferences. The old gelding preferred gentle circular movements when being soothed, while the young mare responded better to firm, steady pressure. The paint horse that carried Ayana was naturally suspicious, but deeply loyal once trust was established. "Horses are like people," Ayana explained as they worked together. "Some are born confident, others must learn to trust. Some carry old hurts that make them careful. Others have spirits too generous for their own good. The key is learning to see each one clearly without expecting them to be something they are not." Sarah absorbed these lessons with an intensity that amazed both her teacher and her parents. She seemed to understand not just the techniques, but the philosophy behind them. The idea that healing came not from imposing one's will on another creature, but from creating harmony between two spirits. Her success with the injured mare became the talk of Cedar Flats. Within a week, the animal was moving freely, her injured leg bearing weight normally. Word spread, and other settlers began bringing their animals to the girl, who seemed to have inherited some mysterious gift for healing. But with success came increased scrutiny from those who viewed Ayana's influence with suspicion. Reverend Peters made pointed comments about the dangers of primitive superstitions during his Sunday sermons. Some of the men gathered in the evenings to discuss what they saw as a growing problem, an Apache warrior who had been meant to pass through but instead seemed to be establishing a permanent presence. Sarah, Caught between her growing connection to Ayana's teachings and her love for her adoptive family, began to feel the weight of divided loyalties. The music from the flute called to something deep in her soul, but she could see the worry in Mary's eyes and the tension in Thomas's shoulders whenever the subject of her lessons arose. One evening, as she helped Mary with the dinner dishes, Sarah finally voiced the question that had been troubling her for days. "Mama Mary, am I changing in ways that scare you?" Mary's hands stilled on the plate she was drying. "Oh, sweetheart, you're not scaring me. You're growing, discovering parts of yourself that have always been there. That's natural and good. But I love you so much, and sometimes I worry that in discovering who you are, you might decide that what we have together isn't enough." Sarah set down her dish towel and turned to face her adoptive mother fully. "You and Papa Tom are my family," she said with all the fierce certainty a 12-year-old could muster. "Learning about horses and music and healing doesn't change that. It just means I have more to offer, not that I love you less." Mary gathered her daughter into a hug that spoke of years of love and moments of fear, of a woman who had opened her heart completely to a child not born to her blood and who would fight anyone who tried to diminish that bond. The day everything began to change started like any other, with Sarah meeting Ayana by the creek as the first light touched the eastern mountains. But this morning, he carried something wrapped in soft leather, something he handled with the reverence reserved for sacred objects. "I want to show you something," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made Sarah immediately attentive. "But first, you must promise me that you will speak honestly about what you see, even if it troubles you." Sarah nodded solemnly, recognizing the gravity in his tone. Ayana unwrapped the leather carefully, revealing a daguerreotype photograph damaged by time and weather, its edges cracked and its surface clouded, but still clear enough to make out the figures within. The photograph showed an Apache family, a man with long braids and traditional dress, a woman with kind eyes and intricate jewelry, and 3 children of varying ages. But it was the baby in the woman's arms that drew Sarah's attention like a magnet. Something about that tiny face, those bright eyes, seemed achingly familiar. "This is my family," Ayana said quietly, taken by a traveling photographer in the last peaceful summer before the relocations began. "That is my father, my mother, my brother, and my sister Nayeli." His finger indicated each figure in turn, finally resting on the baby. "And this is Nayeli's daughter, my niece, born in the spring before the soldiers came." Sarah stared at the photograph, her young mind struggling with emotions and recognitions she couldn't quite name. The baby's face, something about the shape of the eyes, the set of the mouth made her heart race with a familiarity that defied explanation. "What happened to them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "My parents died during the forced march to the reservation," Ayana said, old pain evident in every word. "My brother was killed fighting the cavalry. And Nayeli, she disappeared with her baby during the chaos of that terrible winter. I searched for months, followed every rumor, every possible trail, but they had vanished like smoke." "The baby," Sarah said, unable to look away from the tiny face in the photograph. "What was her name?" "Little Dove," Ayana replied. "In Apache, we called her Kiisha. She would be about your age now, if she survived." The Apache words hit Sarah like a physical blow, not because they were foreign, but because they felt like coming home. Kiisha Little, the sounds rolled through her mind with perfect familiarity, as if she had heard them spoken in love 1,000 times. "I know that name," she whispered, her hands beginning to tremble. "I don't remember learning it, but I know it. And when you said it just now, I felt loved." Ayana's dark eyes were filled with hope and heartbreak in equal measure. "Child, may I see your necklace? Truly see it, in good light?" With shaking fingers, Sarah lifted the beaded necklace from around her neck and handed it to him. "In the morning, Sunlight. Every detail was clearly visible. The specific pattern of turquoise and silver. The way certain beads caught the light. The traditional Apache symbols worked into the design. "This necklace," Ayana said, his voice thick with emotion, "was made by my grandmother for her granddaughters. The pattern tells the story of our family line, going back 7 generations. Each bead was blessed. Each symbol has meaning. I watched my grandmother teach this exact design to Nayeli when she was preparing for motherhood." Sarah felt the world spinning around her. The photograph, the necklace, the name that felt like a prayer on her lips. It was too much and not enough all at once. "But I'm Sarah McKinnon," she said desperately. "I was found after an Apache raid. My mother died protecting me from Apaches, didn't she?" "What if your mother was Apache?" Ayana asked gently. "What if she died trying to hide you? From the soldiers, not from my people?" The question hung in the air between them like a bridge neither quite dared to cross. Sarah looked again at the baby in the photograph, then at her own hands, her own reflection in the creek water. The coloring was wrong, her hair too light, her eyes too green, but something in the bone structure, something in the way she held herself, echoed the woman in the picture. That afternoon, as Sarah helped Mary tend their small garden, she found herself unconsciously gathering certain plants, sage, sweetgrass, other herbs she had no memory of being taught to recognize. Her hands moved with sure knowledge, selecting the best specimens and avoiding those that were too young or too old. "Sarah," Mary said carefully, "where did you learn which plants to pick?" Sarah looked down at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. Her basket contained exactly the herbs Ayana had been teaching her to use for horse medicine, plus several others that seemed to have called to her without conscious thought. "I don't know," she admitted. "They just seemed right." That evening, as the family sat down to dinner, Sarah found herself speaking Apache words without realizing it, asking for water as tea, thanking her parents with a hee-hee. Each time it happened, she stopped in confusion, unsure where the words had come from. "Sweetheart," Thomas said finally, "are you feeling all right? You seem different today." "Papa Tom," Sarah said, her voice small and confused, "what if I'm not who we thought I was? What if my whole life has been based on something that isn't true?" The pain in her voice made Mary reach across the table to take her hand. "Sarah, honey, you are exactly who you've always been, our daughter. The girl who heals animals and brings joy to everyone who knows her. Nothing can change that, no matter what we learn about where you came from. But what if I came from people who were supposed to be enemies? What if the story about my mother being killed by Apaches is wrong?" Thomas and Mary exchanged a long look across the table. They had always known this conversation would come eventually, but they hadn't expected it so soon or in quite this way. "The truth," Thomas said carefully, "is that we've never known exactly what happened the day you were found. There was a battle. People died on both sides, and in the aftermath, you were discovered, hidden and crying. The soldiers assumed your Apache mother had stolen you from white settlers. But it could have been the other way around," Sarah finished, her young mind grasping the implications quickly. "I could be Apache, couldn't I? Really and truly Apache?" That night, Sarah lay awake staring at the daguerreotype Ayana had allowed her to borrow. In the moonlight, the baby's face seemed even more familiar, as if she were looking at a mirror that reflected not her present self but her deepest origins. She thought about the flute music that had called to her soul, the healing knowledge that seemed to flow from some ancient source within her, the Apache words that felt more natural on her tongue than English sometimes did. Most of all, she thought about the way Ayana looked at her, not with the careful affection of a teacher for a student, but with the deep, complicated love of family, recognizing family after years of separation. Tomorrow, she decided she would ask him to tell her everything he remembered about his sister and her baby daughter. She would ask him to teach her more Apache words, more of the traditional ways, more of the songs that seemed to live in her blood. And slowly, carefully, she would begin to piece together the truth of who she really was, not to replace the love she had always known, but to complete the picture of herself that had always seemed to have missing pieces. The photograph seemed to glow in the moonlight, and Sarah fell asleep holding it against her heart, dreaming of desert winds and women's voices singing lullabies in a language that felt like home. Sarah woke before dawn with her hair already braided, not in the simple plait Mary had taught her, but in an intricate pattern she had never seen before. Her fingers had moved without conscious thought during the night, weaving her hair into a design that incorporated small beads and caught the morning light in a way that seemed almost ceremonial. She stared at her reflection in the wash basin, trying to understand how her sleeping mind had known exactly how to create such a complex style. The braids felt right, natural, as if this was how her hair was meant to be worn. But when she tried to remember learning the technique, she found only empty spaces where memories should have been. Ayanna was waiting by the creek, as always, but today he had company 2 other Apache men who had arrived sometime during the night. They were younger than Ayanna, perhaps in their 30s, with the weathered faces of men who had spent their lives outdoors. When they saw Sarah approaching with her elaborately braided hair, they exchanged meaningful glances. "Sarah," Ayanna said, his voice carefully controlled, "I would like you to meet my nephews, Goethle and Nalnish. They have traveled far to join us." The 2 men studied Sarah with the intensity of people solving a puzzle. Goethle, the taller of the 2, stepped forward and spoke in rapid Apache. Sarah found herself understanding every word, even though she was certain she had never been formally taught the language. "He says you wear your hair as his grandmother did," Ayanna translated, though Sarah had already understood, "and that your way of standing reminds him of women from our family." "I understood him," Sarah said quietly. "I understood every word, even though I shouldn't have." Nalnish spoke next, his voice gentle but probing. He asked about her dreams, her memories of early childhood, whether she remembered specific Apache songs or stories. To each question, Sarah found herself responding in his own language, the words flowing as naturally as breathing. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Sarah had experienced. For the first time in her life, she spoke with people who seemed to understand not just her words, but the rhythm of her thoughts. When she described the dreams that had been growing stronger each night, visions of desert landscapes, the sound of women singing, the feeling of being carried across vast distances, they nodded with recognition rather than concern. "Child," Goethle said finally, switching to English for the benefit of any settlement residents who might be listening. "What you described is what our people call the calling of blood. When someone has been separated from their tribe, their spirit remembers, even when their mind does not." "But how can I be sure?" Sarah asked. "What if I'm imagining all of this? What if I just want to belong somewhere so badly that I'm making myself believe things that aren't true?" The answer came not from words but from demonstration. Ayanna produced a small piece of silver and some turquoise beads, along with the tools needed for traditional jewelry making. He showed her the basic techniques once, briefly, then handed her the materials. "Make something," he said simply. "Let your hands remember what your mind has forgotten." Sarah took the tools, feeling their weight and balance. Without conscious planning, she began to work, not with the hesitant movements of a beginner, but with the fluid confidence of someone who had done this countless times before. Her fingers shaped the silver, positioned the beads, created patterns that seemed to emerge from some deep reservoir of inherited knowledge. When she finished, she held up a small hair ornament, a traditional Apache piece that perfectly matched the style of her mysterious morning braids. The design was complex, incorporating symbols she didn't consciously know the meaning of, but which felt absolutely right. The three Apache men stared at her work in amazement. That pattern, Nalish said softly, was known only to the women of our grandmother's line. It has not been made for 15 years, since the last of the old women died. How did I know how to make it? Sarah whispered, staring at her own creation as if it had been crafted by strangers' hands. Because it lives in your blood, Ayana replied. Because you are exactly who I have begun to believe you are, my sister's daughter, returned to us after all these years of searching. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their emotional moment. Thomas Whitman rode up accompanied by several other settlement men, their faces set in hard lines of determination. Behind them, Sarah could see Mary walking quickly from the direction of the house, her expression worried. Ayana, Thomas said without preamble, we need to talk. About what concerns you? Ayana replied calmly, though his nephews had positioned themselves protectively on either side of him. About the influence you're having on our daughter, Thomas said. About the way she's changing, becoming something she never was before. I am not changing her, Ayana said quietly. I am helping her remember who she has always been. She was a Christian girl, raised proper in a civilized home, Reverend Peters interjected, having arrived with the group. Now she's braiding her hair like a savage and making heathen jewelry. This corruption has to stop. Sarah felt anger flare. In her chest, a hot, protective rage that surprised her with its intensity. I am not being corrupted, she said, her voice carrying authority that made the adults pause. I am learning about parts of myself that were always there. The healing, the music, the way I understand animals, none of that is new. It's just stronger now that I have someone to teach me properly. Sarah, Mary said gently, reaching her side, we're worried about you. You're so young to be dealing with such complicated questions about identity and belonging. But Mama Mary, Sarah replied, isn't it better to know the truth than to live with questions that never get answered, even if the truth is complicated? Mary looked at the hair ornament in Sarah's hand, recognizing the skill required to create such intricate work. You made this yourself? My hands seem to know how, Sarah said simply. For a long moment, the group stood in tense silence. Then Gayathle spoke, his words directed to the settlement men but his eyes on Sarah. Among our people, he said, when a child shows the signs of calling blood, we have ceremonies to help them understand their gift. We teach them about the responsibilities that come with inherited knowledge. We do not try to suppress what the spirits have awakened. And what exactly are you suggesting? Thomas asked warily. That you allow us to teach her properly, Ayana replied. Not to take her from the family she loves, but to give her the tools she needs to understand all aspects of her heritage. She belongs to both worlds now. Let her learn to walk in both with honor. Sarah looked from her Apache family to her adoptive parents, seeing the love and fear and hope in all their faces. She was beginning to understand that this moment was a crossroads, a choice that would shape not just her immediate future, but the kind of person she would become. I want to learn, she said quietly but firmly. I want to understand where these gifts come from and how to use them properly. But I also want to stay with the family who raised me and loved me when I had nowhere else to go. Can I be both? Can I honor all the parts of who I am? The question hung in the morning air like a prayer, seeking answers that none of them had ever had to find before. In the days that followed the confrontation, an uneasy truce settled over Cedar Flats. The Apache men remained camped by the creek, while Sarah continued her lessons, but under the watchful eyes of the entire settlement. Every conversation was scrutinized. Every new skill she displayed was debated in worried whispers. It was during this tense period that Sarah created something that would change everything. A small medicine bag that seemed to materialize from her hands as naturally as breathing. She had been working with Ayana and his nephews to help a settler's sick calf when the inspiration struck. The animal was weak, refusing to nurse, and conventional treatments had failed. Sarah found herself gathering materials, almost without conscious thought: soft leather from an old glove, sinew for thread, specific stones from the creek bed, and herbs that seemed to call to her hands. Under the late afternoon sun, her fingers moved with practiced precision, creating a small pouch decorated with beadwork and patterns that made Goethe catch his breath. The design was unmistakably traditional, not just Apache, but specifically from their grandmother's lineage. The symbols told a story of healing and protection, of connections between the spirit world and the world of living beings. "Child," Nalish said softly, "where'd you learn those patterns?" "I didn't learn them," Sarah replied, still working. "They just came to me, like the music does, like the words do. It's as if my hands remember things my mind never knew." When she finished the medicine bag, she filled it with the herbs she had gathered and hung it around the calf's neck. Within hours, the young animal was standing and nursing strongly. By the next morning, it was running in the pasture with renewed vigor. Word of the miracle spread quickly through Cedar Flats, creating a divide among the residents. Some saw Sarah's gift as a blessing that could benefit the entire community. Others viewed it as evidence of dangerous supernatural influences that threatened the Christian order of their settlement. The situation came to a head when Reverend Peters organized what he called a prayer meeting, but which everyone understood to be a tribunal. The entire adult population of Cedar Flats gathered in the small church, with Sarah standing before them like a young defendant facing judgment. "This child," Reverend Peters declared, "has been exhibiting behaviors that are incompatible with Christian faith. She speaks in heathen tongues, practices pagan rituals, and claims to possess supernatural powers. We must decide whether to allow this corruption to continue or take steps to save her soul." Thomas Whitman rose to defend his daughter. "Sarah has done nothing but heal sick animals and learn about her heritage. Those are not crimes, Reverend. They're not even sins. The very fact that she can perform these acts proves she has been touched by unchristian forces," Peters replied. "We have a responsibility to guide her back to the righteous path." Sarah listened to the debate swirling around her with growing frustration. These people were discussing her life, her identity, her future, as if she were property to be disposed of, rather than a person with her own thoughts and feelings. Finally, she could bear it no longer. Rising to her feet, she spoke with a voice that carried far more authority than her 12 years should have possessed. "You want to know what I am?" she said, her words ringing clearly through the small church. "I am a healer. I am someone who can ease the suffering of animals and, if given the chance, probably people too. I am a daughter to the parents who raised me with love, and I am also the descendant of people who lived on this land for generations before any of us were born." She paused, looking directly at Reverend Peters. "If God gave me these gifts, and who else could have, then shouldn't I use them to help his creatures? Isn't healing the sick exactly what Jesus did?" The question struck the heart of the theological argument, and Peters found himself momentarily speechless. Mary Whitman stood up, her voice steady despite the tremor of emotion underneath. "I've watched this child grow from an infant who wouldn't stop crying into a young woman who brings peace to every living thing she touches. If that's corruption, then I pray God will corrupt us all." "The question," said Dr. Harrison, the settlement's physician, "isn't whether Sarah's gifts are real. We've all seen the results. The question is whether we're wise enough to appreciate the blessing we've been given." The debate continued late into the evening, but the tide was turning. Too many residents had benefited from Sarah's ability to heal their animals. Too many had seen the gentleness and wisdom that guided her actions. Whatever the source of her powers, the results spoke for themselves. Thought it was Ayana who finally provided the solution that would satisfy both communities. "Among my people," he said, addressing the gathered settlers. When someone shows great gifts, they are trained in the proper use of those abilities. They learn not just techniques, but ethics, how to use power responsibly, how to serve their community rather than themselves. He looked directly at Reverend Peters. Your Jesus was a healer. He taught others to heal. Sarah's gifts come from the same divine source, expressed through the traditions of her blood people. Let us teach her properly, so she may serve both communities with wisdom and humility. The compromise that emerged was unprecedented. Sarah would continue learning traditional Apache healing methods, but she would also receive formal education from Dr. Harrison in modern veterinary medicine. She would study with Ayanna and his nephews about the spiritual aspects of healing, but she would also continue her Christian education with her parents. Most importantly, she would remain Sarah McKinnon, beloved daughter of Thomas and Mary, while also embracing her identity as Little Dove, niece of Ayanna and descendant of a proud Apache lineage. That night, as Sarah lay in her bed with the medicine bag resting on her nightstand, she reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few short weeks. The scared, confused girl who had found an arrowhead in the corral dirt was gone, replaced by someone who was beginning to understand that identity didn't have to be simple or singular. She was Apache and white, Christian and traditional, a daughter of two families and a member of two communities. The complexity that had once frightened her now felt like strength, like having more colors available when painting a picture of herself. Through her window, she could see the glow of the Apache camp by the creek, and beyond that, the warm light from her parents' bedroom where Mary and Thomas were probably discussing the day's events and planning for tomorrow. Both lights represented home, both represented love, and both represented parts of herself that she was determined never to deny again. The medicine bag seemed to pulse gently in the moonlight, as if reflecting the rhythm of her own heart, strong, steady, and finally at peace with all the different beats that created its unique song. The revelation came on a morning when autumn had begun to paint the cottonwoods gold, and Sarah had been living her dual life for nearly 2 months. She had grown comfortable with her identity as both McKinnon and Apache, moving between worlds with increasing confidence. But comfort, she was about to learn, could be shattered in an instant by the truth. Mary Whitman had been unusually quiet all week, watching Sarah with the particular intensity of someone wrestling with a difficult decision. Several times, Sarah had caught her mother starting to speak, then stopping herself with a shake of her head. Thomas, too, seemed burdened by unspoken thoughts, his usual easy conversation replaced by thoughtful silences. The confrontation came when Sarah arrived home from her morning lessons to find Mary sitting at the kitchen table with an old wooden box open before her, a box Sarah had never seen before, filled with papers and documents that looked official and important. "Sarah," Mary said, her voice carefully controlled, "we need to talk." Something in her tone made Sarah's stomach clench with anxiety. This was not the voice of everyday conversation or even gentle correction. This was the voice of a woman preparing to deliver news that would change everything. "What is it, Mama Mary?" Mary gestured to the chair across from her, and Sarah sat down, her eyes fixed on the mysterious box and its contents. "I've been watching you these past weeks," Mary began, "seeing how happy you are learning about your Apache heritage, how natural it all seems to you. And I've been struggling with something I should have told you long ago." She reached into the box and withdrew a folded document, yellowed with age and bearing the official seal of the Territorial Church Registry. "This is your birth record," Mary said quietly. "The real one." Sarah's world tilted sideways. "My birth record? But I thought, you always said I was found without any papers, that no one knew who I really was." "That's what we told everyone," Mary said, her voice heavy with years of carefully maintained deception. "But it wasn't true. We knew exactly who you were from the very first day. With trembling hands, Mary unfolded the document and spread it on the table. The writing was faded but still legible, and Sarah found herself staring at words that rewrote her entire life story. Birth certificate. Name: Little Dove, Kiisha. Mother: Nayeli of the Chiricahua Apache. Father: unknown. Born: Spring 1861. Found: August 15th, 1861. Following cavalry engagement with Apache band near Skeleton Canyon. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. There it was, written in official script, confirmation of everything Ayanna had suspected, everything her own heart had been trying to tell her. "You knew," she whispered. "All this time, you knew I was his niece." "Yes," Mary said, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. "We knew your mother's name. We knew you were Apache born and bred. The soldiers who found you told us everything how. Your mother had hidden you in a cave, how she died trying to protect you from the battle, how the sacred necklace had been placed around your neck as her final act." Sarah stared at the document, then at Mary, struggling to process the magnitude of this deception. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me grow up thinking my mother was killed by Apaches instead of killed trying to protect me from soldiers?" Mary's composure cracked completely. "Because we were terrified of losing you," she sobbed. "Because we loved you so much from the very first moment, and we knew that if people understood you were truly Apache, not just a white child stolen by Indians, but Apache born, there would be those who would try to take you away from us." Thomas appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of his wife's tears. His face was gray with the weight of their long-held secret. "The truth," he said heavily, "is that your mother, your Apache mother, lived long enough after the battle to tell the soldiers her story. She said she was trying to get you to safety, away from the fighting. She made them promise to find you a good family, to let you grow up knowing love instead of hatred. Nayeli asked specifically that you keep the necklace," Mary added, wiping her eyes. "She said it would help you remember her when you were old enough to understand. She wanted you to know where you came from, but she also wanted you to have a chance at a peaceful life." Sarah felt as if the ground beneath her feet had disappeared entirely. Everything she thought she knew about her origins, about the circumstances that had brought her to Cedar Flats, about the motivations and fears that had shaped her childhood, all of it had been built on a foundation of loving lies. "So when Ayanna recognized the necklace," she said slowly, working through the implications, "when he started teaching me about Apache ways, you knew he was really my uncle? You knew I was learning about my own heritage, not just some interesting cultural exchange?" "We suspected from the first day," Thomas admitted. "The way he looked at that necklace, the questions he asked about your age, it was obvious he thought he knew who you were. And when you started responding so naturally to his teaching, when the Apache words came so easily to you, we knew for certain. Then why did you let the church meeting happen? Why did you let Reverend Peters and the others debate whether my gifts were evil if you knew they came from my own blood family?" Mary reached across the table to take Sarah's hands. "Because we were still afraid," she said honestly. "Afraid that once you learned the whole truth, you might decide that your real family was more important than the people who raised you. Afraid that we might lose the daughter who had become the center of our world." The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sound of Ayanna's voice teaching his nephews by the creek. Sarah looked again at the birth certificate, at the name written in careful script. Little Dove, daughter of Nayeli. "Is there anything else?" she asked quietly. "Any other secrets, any other lies I need to know about?" Mary and Thomas exchanged a glance, and Sarah felt her heart sink. "There's one more thing," Thomas said reluctantly. He reached into the box and withdrew another document. This one, a letter, written in careful English on Apache reservation stationery. "This arrived last month," he said. from the Indian agent at the San Carlos reservation. He'd heard rumors that a girl matching your description was living in our settlement, and he was inquiring about returning you to your tribe. Sarah took the letter with numb fingers, reading the official language that discussed her as if she were lost property to be returned to its rightful owners. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing yet," Thomas admitted. "We didn't know how to answer without knowing what you would want us to say." The weight of all these revelations settled on Sarah's shoulders like a heavy blanket. Her entire life had been shaped by decisions made to protect her, but also to protect the fears and desires of the people who loved her. She was not angry, she understood the love that had motivated their deception, but she felt suddenly much older than her 30 years. "I need to think," she said finally, standing up from the table. "I need to process all of this." "Sarah," Mary called as she reached the door, "I hope you can forgive us. Everything we did was out of love for you." Sarah turned back, seeing the genuine anguish in her adoptive mother's face. "I know, Mama Mary. I know you love me. But love doesn't make lies true, and protection doesn't." Erase the need for honesty. She walked out into the autumn afternoon, the birth certificate clutched in her hand, and her mind reeling with the implications of everything she had learned. By the creek, Ayanna looked up from his conversation with his nephews, immediately sensing that something momentous had occurred. "Uncle," she said, using the Apache word that now carried its full, true meaning, "we need to talk. I have something to show you that will change everything." As she approached with the document that would confirm their relationship beyond any doubt, Sarah realized that her journey of self-discovery was not ending. It was just beginning. The girl who had started this adventure by finding an arrowhead in the dirt was gone forever, replaced by someone who finally knew exactly who she was and exactly what choices lay before her. The birth certificate lay between them on the soft grass by the creek, its aged paper catching the afternoon light like a bridge between past and present. Ayanna stared at the document with hands that trembled slightly, his weathered face cycling through emotions too complex for words: grief for his lost sister, joy at finding her daughter, and something deeper that spoke to the healing of wounds that had festered for 13 long years. "Nayeli," he whispered, touching the name on the paper as if it were sacred. "My little sister. She lived long enough to save you." Sarah watched her uncle process the revelation, seeing how it both completed and complicated the connection they had been building. She was no longer a girl who might be his niece. She was definitively his sister's daughter, the child he had searched for across 3 territories and never found. "The letter from the reservation agent," she said, showing him the second document. "What does it mean for me? For us?" Ayanna read the official correspondence carefully, his expression growing troubled. "It means," he said finally, "that the government knows you exist, knows you are Apache, and believes you should be returned to your people on the reservation. They consider you a ward of the Federal Indian Office." "But I don't want to go to a reservation," Sarah said with sudden fierceness. "I want to stay here with the McKinnons, learning from you and your nephews. Can't I choose?" "The law does not often recognize the choices of Indian children," Goifle said grimly, having read the letter over Ayanna's shoulder. "To them, you are property that was misplaced and should be returned to its proper location." The weight of the situation began to settle on all of them. This was no longer a simple matter of personal identity and family relationships. The federal government had taken an interest, and that meant legal complications that could tear apart everything they had been building. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked. "The letter requests a response within 60 days of receipt," Thomas Whitman said, approaching the group with Mary at his side. Both parents looked haggard, as if they had aged years in the past few hours. "That gives us perhaps 3 weeks to figure out what to do." Mary knelt beside Sarah, her eyes red from crying, but her voice steady. "Whatever we decide, together, all of us." This affects our whole family now, both families. Over the following days, Cedar Flats became the site of intense discussions as the two communities, Apache and settler, wrestled with a problem none of them had expected to face. The legal implications were complex and frightening. If the government decided to enforce its claim on Sarah, neither her adoptive parents nor her Apache family would have much power to stop them. It was during one of these tense discussions that Ayanna made a decision that would reshape everything. He reached into his worn leather satchel and withdrew a bundle of papers he had carried for more than a decade, documents that represented one of the darkest chapters in his personal history. "There is something you all need to understand," he sighed, his voice heavy with old pain, "about why the government's promises cannot be trusted, and why sending Sarah to a reservation would be a death sentence for her spirit, if not her body." He spread the papers on the table in Thomas's store, where the informal council had gathered. The documents were treaty papers, official agreements between the United States government and various Apache bands, signed with great ceremony and broken with callous indifference. "These treaties," Ayanna explained, "promise my people protection, fair treatment, adequate food and supplies in exchange for giving up our ancestral lands. Every single promise was broken. The reservations are places of hunger, disease, and despair. Children are taken from their families and sent to boarding schools where they are forbidden to speak their own language or practice their traditions." He pointed to specific clauses in the treaties, his finger tracing lines of text that had once represented hope, but now stood as monuments to betrayal. "This treaty promised medical care. There is no doctor at San Carlos. This one guaranteed adequate food supplies. People starve there regularly. This one assured religious freedom. Apache ceremonies are forbidden under penalty of imprisonment." Sarah stared at the documents, beginning to understand the full scope of what the government letter meant. "They would take me away from both my families and put me in a place where I couldn't be Apache or white, where I couldn't be anything but what they decided I should be." "Exactly," Nalish said bitterly. "The reservations are not meant to preserve Apache culture. They are meant to destroy it slowly, to turn us into something acceptable to white society while keeping us separate from it." Mary Whitman listened to this recitation of broken promises with growing horror. "But surely there must be some legal way to prevent this. Sarah is our legally adopted daughter. We have papers that could be invalidated the moment the government chooses to do so," Thomas said grimly. He had been researching the legal situation, and what he had learned was not encouraging. Indian children have no rights under territorial law if the federal government decides to claim jurisdiction. Dr. Harrison, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up. "What if we could prove that Sarah is better served remaining here? What if we could demonstrate that she's receiving superior education, better medical care, and cultural training? That actually preserves Apache traditions rather than destroying them." "It would require documentation," Ayanna said thoughtfully. "Proof that she is learning properly, that she is being raised with respect for both cultures. And it would require witnesses," added Goethle. "People who could testify that this arrangement serves the best interests of the child." An idea began to form, not a simple solution, but a complex strategy that would require courage from everyone involved. They would need to create an official record of Sarah's education and development, one that showed her thriving in a bicultural environment. They would need testimony from both communities about the benefits of the arrangement. Most importantly, they would need Sarah herself to be prepared to speak eloquently about her own desires and understanding. "There's something else," Sarah said quietly, an idea crystallizing in her young mind. "What if we invited other people to see what we're building here? What if we could show them that this kind of cooperation between communities actually works?" "A gathering," Mary said, understanding immediately. "Like a celebration, but also a demonstration of how much you've learned and grown." But it would have to be before the deadline for responding to the government letter, Thomas pointed out. We would have less than 3 weeks to organize something. That could change Sarah's entire future. The plan that emerged over the following days was ambitious and risky. They would host a gathering that would bring together representatives from multiple communities: Apache, Mexican, Anglo settlers, even territorial officials, if they could be convinced to attend. Sarah would demonstrate her skills in both traditional Apache healing and modern veterinary medicine. She would speak in multiple languages, show her understanding of both Christian and Apache spiritual traditions, and prove that a child could honor multiple heritages without losing her core identity. But the gathering would be more than just a display of Sarah's abilities. It would be a statement about the possibility of coexistence, about building bridges between cultures instead of walls. If it succeeded, it might not only save Sarah from forced relocation, but also create a model for how different peoples could live and learn together. If it failed, Sarah would likely be torn away from everything and everyone she loved, sent to a reservation where her unique gifts would be seen as problems to be corrected rather than blessings to be nurtured. As the days passed, the entire settlement threw itself into preparations. Mary worked with Apache women to prepare foods that represented both cultures. Thomas coordinated with territorial officials, carefully framing the invitation as a celebration of successful assimilation rather than a challenge to government authority. Dr. Harrison documented Sarah's medical knowledge and healing successes. Meanwhile, Ayanna and his nephews began teaching Sarah the formal protocols she would need to know: how to address respected elders, how to present herself in traditional Apache ceremonies, how to speak about her heritage with the dignity and gravity the occasion would require. Remember, Ayanna told her as they practiced by the creek one evening, you are not just speaking for yourself. You are speaking for the possibility that our peoples can find new ways to honor the old ways. You are speaking for the children who will come after you, who will need to know that it is possible to live in two worlds without losing yourself in either. The weight of responsibility was enormous for a 13-year-old girl, but Sarah felt ready for it in a way that surprised even herself. The confused child who had found an arrowhead in the corral dirt was gone, replaced by someone who understood exactly who she was and what she stood for. 3 days before the gathering, as Sarah practiced her presentation one final time, she realized that regardless of what happened, she had already won the most important victory. She knew her history, she understood her heritage, and she had found her place in the world, not as someone caught between two cultures, but as someone who could build bridges between them. The girl who had once worn her Apache necklace without understanding its meaning now wore it as a symbol of conscious choice, cultural pride, and the unbreakable connections that link past, present, and future. Whatever the government officials decided, whatever the future held, she would face it. As Little Dove McKinnon, fully Apache, fully American, and fully herself. The morning of the gathering dawned clear and bright, with a crispness in the air that spoke of winter's approach and the urgency of decisions that could no longer be delayed. Sarah woke before sunrise, her stomach tight with nervous energy, and spent the early hours in meditation by the creek, as Ayanna had taught her, centering herself for what would be the most important day of her young life. By mid-morning, people began arriving from across the territory. Wagons rolled into Cedar Flats, carrying curious settlers who had heard rumors of the unusual arrangement. Apache families came on horseback, their travel-worn faces showing both hope and skepticism about what they might witness. Most importantly, 3 territorial officials arrived in an official carriage, including Indian Agent Morrison from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the man who would ultimately decide Sarah's fate. The gathering was held in the largest open space available between the church and the corral, where Sarah had first demonstrated her gift with animals. Someone had strung colorful bunting between the buildings, and tables laden with food represented both cultures: Mary's cornbread and apple pies, alongside traditional Apache dishes prepared by the visiting families. But beneath the festive atmosphere lay a tension that everyone felt. This was not merely a celebration, it was a trial in all but name, with Sarah's future hanging in the balance. Agent Morrison was a stern man in his 50s, with the particular weariness of someone who had spent years dealing with what the government termed the Indian problem. He surveyed the mixed gathering with obvious skepticism, clearly expecting to find either a naive experiment that had gotten out of hand, or a calculated deception designed to circumvent federal authority. "I understand," he said to Thomas Whitman, "that you claim this Apache child has been successfully integrated into civilized society while somehow maintaining her savage heritage. That seems contradictory to everything we know about proper assimilation." "Perhaps," Thomas replied carefully, "you should observe before drawing conclusions." The formal portion of the gathering began with Ayanna speaking in Apache, his words translated by Sarah herself as she demonstrated her fluency in her ancestral language. She spoke about the importance of honoring one's heritage while embracing new opportunities, about the healing gifts that connected her to both communities, and about the responsibility that came with walking between worlds. Her words were met with nods of approval from the Apache visitors, but Agent Morrison's expression remained skeptical. The demonstration that followed was unprecedented. Sarah worked with a horse that had been brought specifically for the occasion, an animal with a reputation for being difficult to handle, nervous around strangers, and resistant to training. Using techniques that blended Apache traditions with modern veterinary knowledge, she approached the horse with a confidence that amazed even those who knew her well. Speaking softly in both English and Apache, she diagnosed a subtle injury that had been making the animal defensive and administered treatment using both herbal remedies and modern medical supplies. Within an hour, the horse was calm, responsive, and clearly more comfortable. "Impressive stagecraft," Agent Morrison commented dismissively. "But training a child to perform tricks hardly demonstrates successful assimilation." It was then that Reverend Peters, who had once opposed Sarah's Apache education, stepped forward to speak on her behalf. "Agent Morrison," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his position, "I initially shared your concerns about this arrangement. I worried that exposure to native traditions would corrupt a Christian child's development. I was wrong." He gestured toward Sarah, who stood proudly in a dress that incorporated both calico fabric and traditional Apache beadwork. "This young woman has grown into someone who embodies the best of both cultures. She serves our community as a healer. She honors her God through service to his creatures, and she carries forward traditions that might otherwise be lost forever." More importantly, Dr. Harrison added, producing a thick folder of documentation, her medical knowledge already exceeds that of many trained veterinarians. She has successfully treated dozens of animals using methods that combine the best of traditional and modern approaches. To waste such talent by confining her to a reservation would be a crime against both communities. The Apache visitors had been largely silent during the English language discussions, but now an elderly woman named Grandmother Willow stood to speak. Sarah translated her words, which carried the weight of someone who had lived through the worst of the government's broken promises. "She says," Sarah interpreted, "that the reservations are places where Apache children forget how to be Apache. She says, I am more truly connected to our traditions here, learning properly from my uncle, than I would be on government land where our ceremonies are forbidden." Agent Morrison looked increasingly uncomfortable as testimony piled up from both communities. Whatever he had expected to find, it was not this unified support for an arrangement that clearly benefited everyone involved. The turning point came when Sarah herself finally addressed him directly, speaking with the poise and wisdom of someone far beyond her 13 years. "Sir," she said, "I understand that you believe children like me belong on reservations with our own people. But what if there's another way? What if we can honor our heritage while also building bridges between communities? What if the future doesn't have to be about separation, but about finding new ways to live together? Her words hung in the afternoon air, challenging assumptions that had guided federal policy for decades and opening possibilities that none of the officials had considered before. The moment that would define everything came when Sarah announced her final demonstration, the creation of something that had never existed before, a physical symbol of the integration she represented. "I want to show you something that represents who I am," she said, addressing Agent Morrison directly, but speaking loudly enough for the entire gathering to hear. Not just Apache, not just white, but something new that honors both traditions. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, working in secret with both Mary and the Apache women who had come for the gathering. Now, she unwrapped a blanket that took everyone's breath away. The blanket was a masterpiece of cultural fusion, traditional Apache geometric patterns woven seamlessly with designs that reflected frontier life. The colors told a story that moved, from the deep reds and oranges of desert sunsets through the blues and greens of mountain forests to the warm browns and golds of farmland. Along the borders, Apache symbols for healing and protection were interwoven with Christian crosses and frontier motifs like horses and homesteads. This blanket, Sarah explained as she held it up for all to see, was made by Apache women and white women working together. Every stitch represents cooperation instead of conflict. Every pattern shows that different traditions can strengthen each other instead of canceling each other out. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, and the effect was transformative. Standing there in the afternoon sunlight, wearing both a calico dress and traditional beadwork, draped in a creation that literally embodied cultural integration, Sarah looked like a vision of what the future could be, if people had the courage to embrace it. "This is what I am," she said simply. "This is what I want to continue becoming." Agent Morrison stared at the blanket, and for the first time since his arrival, his official composure cracked slightly. He had come expecting to find either a failed experiment or a dangerous precedent that needed to be stopped. Instead, he was witnessing something entirely unprecedented, proof that integration could preserve rather than destroy cultural identity. "The federal policy," he said slowly, "is based on the assumption that Native children must choose between their heritage and American citizenship. What you're suggesting is that this choice might be a false one." "Exactly," Thomas Whitman said, seizing the opening. "Sarah proves that a child can be fully American while honoring her Apache blood. She can serve both communities, strengthen both traditions, and build bridges that benefit everyone." Mary stepped forward, her voice strong despite the tears in her eyes. "We're not asking you to ignore the law," she said to Agent Morrison. "We're asking you to help us write a new chapter in how that law is applied." Sarah could be the first of many children who find ways to honor all parts of their heritage. The Apache visitors began to speak among themselves in their own language, and Sarah translated their discussion for the benefit of the English speakers. "They're saying," she interpreted, "that the old ways of living completely separate, constantly fighting, have brought too much pain to both sides. They want to know if there's really a possibility of something different." Grandmother Willow stood again, speaking directly to Agent Morrison through Sarah's translation. "She says the government has taken Apache children away for 50 years. And what do they have to show for it? Children who are neither Apache nor white, who belong nowhere and know nothing of their own history. She says I am proof that there is a better way." The weight of the moment settled on Agent Morrison's shoulders. He looked around at the mixed gathering, Apache and white faces watching him with equal intensity, all hoping he would have the wisdom and courage to see beyond the narrow policies that had guided his career. "Young lady," he said finally, addressing Sarah directly, "if I were to recommend that you remain here, what assurances could you give me that you would continue to develop both sides of your heritage, that this arrangement would truly serve the interests of both communities. Sarah felt the breath of everyone present, waiting for her answer. This was it, the moment that would determine not just her own future, but potentially the future of countless other children who might find themselves caught between cultures. "I give you my word," she said, her young voice carrying absolute conviction, "that I will spend my life building bridges between our peoples. I will use my healing gifts to serve anyone who needs them, regardless of their background. I will teach other children that it's possible to honor multiple heritages without losing yourself. And I will prove that cooperation creates stronger communities than separation ever could." She paused, looking directly into Agent Morrison's eyes. "But more than that, I promise that I will remember this day, this moment when adults had the courage to choose hope over fear, integration over separation. And I will make sure that your decision to trust in something new was the right one." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the wind rustling through the cottonwoods and the distant sound of horses nickering in the corral. Agent Morrison looked at his papers, at the blanket draped around Sarah's shoulders, at the faces of people from two cultures who had found a way to work together for the good of one special child. When he finally spoke, his words would echo through the territory for years to come. 6 months later, Sarah McKinnon, now officially recognized as Little Dove McKinnon in all territorial records, stood in the same spot where she had once knelt beside an injured mare. But everything around her had changed in ways that seemed almost magical. The corral had been expanded into a proper healing center, where animals from across 3 territories came for treatment that combined the best of traditional Apache medicine with modern veterinary science. A small sign by the gate read, "Little Dove Animal Hospital," in both English and Apache, and it had become a symbol of successful cooperation throughout the Southwest. Agent Morrison's decision that day had been revolutionary. Rather than forcing Sarah onto a reservation, he had recommended her case as a pilot program for what he termed cultural integration education. The federal government, surprised by the positive response from both Apache and white communities, had cautiously approved a limited experiment that allowed certain Native children to remain with adoptive families while receiving formal education in their traditional cultures. Sarah had become the first student in what was now called the Heritage Bridge Program, and her success had led to similar arrangements for other children across the territory. 3 more Apache children had been placed with sympathetic white families in the region, while 2 white orphans had been taken in by Apache families. All of them spent time learning from both cultures, and all of them thrived in ways that surprised even the program's supporters. But the changes went far beyond official policy. The relationships forged during that crucial gathering had grown into something unprecedented, a true partnership between communities that had once viewed each other with suspicion and fear. Ayana had established a permanent camp near Cedar Flats, becoming the settlement's unofficial cultural liaison and traditional medicine specialist. His nephews had married local women, 1 Apache, 1 white, and their children were growing up truly bicultural, switching between languages and traditions with the fluid ease that Sarah had pioneered. Mary and Thomas Whitman had become advocates for the Heritage Bridge Program, traveling to other settlements to share their experience and help establish similar arrangements. Their home had become a gathering place where Apache and white families met regularly for shared meals, cultural education sessions, and the kind of informal friendship that made formal cooperation possible. The church, too, had evolved. Reverend Peters, transformed by his experience with Sarah, had begun incorporating Apache spiritual concepts into his sermons, not as replacement for Christian doctrine, but as complementary wisdom about humanity's relationship with the natural world. His Sunday services now included prayers in multiple languages and emphasized the common values that united different faith traditions Dr. Harrison had documented. Sarah's healing methods and published papers that were being read in medical schools across the country. Her integration of traditional plant medicine with modern diagnostic techniques had produced results that were impossible to ignore, and her approach was being studied by veterinarians and physicians alike. But perhaps the most significant change was in Sarah herself. The confused child who had once felt caught between worlds had become a confident young woman who moved between cultures with grace and purpose. She wore her heritage proudly, her hair often braided in traditional Apache styles, her clothes blending elements from both cultures, her turquoise and silver necklace catching the light as she worked. On this particular morning, she was preparing for her most ambitious project yet. At 15, she had been accepted to study veterinary medicine at the Territorial College while simultaneously beginning formal training as a nurse. Apache medicine woman under Grandmother Willow's guidance. She would be the first person in the territory's history to pursue both paths simultaneously, and her success would open doors for countless others. "Are you ready for this?" Ayanna asked, approaching the corral where Sarah was saying goodbye to the horses she had healed over the past months. "I've been ready for this my whole life," she replied, and meant it, even when I didn't know what this was. She paused in her work to look around at the settlement that had become a model for the entire Southwest. Children of multiple backgrounds played together in the streets, their parents working side by side on projects that benefited everyone. The general store carried both traditional Apache crafts and modern manufactured goods. The school taught lessons in 3 languages, and students learned about both scientific method and traditional ecological knowledge. "Do you ever wonder," Sarah asked Ayanna, "what would have happened if you hadn't recognized the necklace that day? If you had just bought your supplies and ridden on?" Ayanna smiled, his weathered face creasing with joy and satisfaction. "I think the spirits would have found another way to bring us together," he said. "Some connections are too strong to be broken by time or distance or even death. Your mother's love, carried in that necklace, was waiting to lead you home, not to a place, but to an understanding of who you truly are." As Sarah prepared to leave for college, she created one final piece for the Heritage Bridge program, a new necklace that would serve as a symbol for other children entering the program. Like her original necklace, it was made with traditional Apache techniques and sacred turquoise. But this one also incorporated elements from other cultures, silver worked in Mexican styles, beads from different tribes, even small crosses that honored the Christian faith of many adoptive families. The necklace told a story of connection rather than separation, of cultures strengthening each other rather than competing. It was beautiful and complex, just like the new world Sarah and her communities had built together. On her last evening in Cedar Flats before leaving for college, Sarah stood by the creek where she had first learned about her heritage. The water still ran clear and cold, reflecting stars that seemed brighter than ever before. But now she understood that those stars were not distant lights, but connections, threads that linked past the present, tradition to innovation, and heart to heart across all the boundaries that people drew to separate themselves from each other. The scared little girl who had found an arrowhead in the corral dirt was gone forever, replaced by a confident young woman who knew exactly who she was and exactly what she wanted to accomplish. Sarah McKinnon, Little Dove, daughter of 2 worlds, and citizen of the future, was ready to heal whatever needed healing and build whatever bridges still needed building. And in the distance, the sound of Apache flutes mingled with church bells, creating a harmony that spoke of hope, healing, and the infinite possibility that opens when people choose love over fear.